The bounty hunting experience in 3.17 is pretty different despite not having any direct changes to how the system works. The AI is now consistently more active, which makes bounties a lot more dangerous and challenging, so we need to change how we approach our combat strategy and ship loadouts. Overall, this has decreased how profitable bounty hunting is because of more time spent in combat, repairing, and restocking, but it's still the most consistently profitable way to make money in the game, and it's a really rewarding experience when you get it right. So let's get into it. The core bounty hunting system hasn't changed since 3.16. You still get a mix of in-space and atmospheric bounties, you still progress through the difficulty ranks by leveling up your reputation with the Bounty Hunters Guild and completing certification missions, and you still get bonus payouts of 5 to 20% based on your reputation with the different planetary security factions, and by taking the mercenary call to arms missions. If you're new to this, check out the first 5 minutes of my video linked above to get an overview. Now let's get into the big changes that impact bounty hunting, starting with the change to size 2 shields. Before 3.17, there used to be a bubble shield, which meant there was a bubble around the entire ship that was one big pool of shield hit points. Shoot it from the back, the front, left, right, top, or bottom, and it takes damage off the same pool of hit points. This is how size 1 shields still work in 3.17, since those shields are usually used on smaller ships, where it'd be hard to hit a particular shield face. But size 2 shields are usually on medium-sized ships, and so they've been changed to have 2 shield faces, which you can think of as a bubble that's split in half, front and back. Half of the size 2 shield covers the front and half covers the back, so you see 50% on the front and back on the shield MFD. And don't worry, the sides of your ship are still shielded, since we've just split that full coverage bubble in half. It's just not represented in the shield MFD since it wouldn't make sense. Size 3 shields are on larger ships and are split even further to 4 shield faces, with 25% of the shield hit points for each shield face. This is the same as it was in 3.16, so only size 2 shields have changed in this patch, but now we can see the overall strategy of having larger shields on larger ships, which get more shield faces for potential attackers to focus down. One benefit of the size 2 shield being split into 2 faces is that it lets either side recharge independently. A shield face needs to not get hit for 5 seconds before it'll start recharging, so if you're able to point the side of your ship that needs recharging away from enemy fire, you could do something like recharge the front shield while the back soaks up some damage. You can see a visual indication of that 5-second cooldown with the white bar expanding outwards on the shield MFD after the shield takes damage. That's nice in theory, but a major downside is that you only have half as much shield HP for an attacker to get through before they can hit your hull if they focus their fire on one side of your ship. To help counter this, they've increased the total HP of size 2 shields by about 20%, but overall the size 2 shields still feel a lot weaker than they were before. And that's even before we get to some potential bugs that may be occurring, with people reporting shield holes on certain ships, which means there are gaps where enemy fire can hit your ship's hull directly while your shields are still up. Ballistic fire can do this by design, but people are reporting this with laser weapon fire as well. There's also something funky going on with hit detection with NPCs, where even if you're shooting at the front of them, it seems to almost always remove their rear shields first, and very inconsistently seems to register damage to their front shield. This means your time to kill in VHRTs becomes a bit inconsistent if a bunch of your damage isn't registered. This, combined with the higher desync compared to 3.16, can definitely be frustrating, but hopefully it gets fixed soon. In the meantime, I've had decent success by trying to get an angle on enemies where I'm not facing them head on, and that seems to have been the best in terms of consistently applying my damage. Another major change in 3.17 is the large rebalancing of missile damage and effective range. All missiles have had their energy damage component removed, so they're doing only physical damage, which means they can penetrate shields and damage hulls and components more than before. But to counter this, most of them are doing significantly less overall damage. For example, the size 1 EM tracking Pioneer missiles do 60% less damage, and the size 2 EM tracking Dominators do 39% less damage. I've been using EM tracking missiles until now because they were the most consistent, since all ships had large EM signatures due to the nerfs to stealth. But now there's an argument for using the thermal tracking Arrow 1 missiles because they do almost twice the damage of the Pioneers and also have a much wider lock range since the Pioneers were changed to have a smaller operating window. I've flown a lot of missions with the Arrow 1 missiles to test them out, and I think they're less consistent in hitting the target than the Pioneers, but as long as you get half the missiles to hit, you're coming out even, and I usually get at least half. Also, sometimes if my Arrow 1 missiles miss their target, they'll actually hit and take out one of the wingmen, since they probably had a high heat signature. It's a decent consolation prize. So for the size 1, I'd go with the thermal tracking Arrow 1 missiles for their more flexible lock range and higher potential damage, and stick with the EM tracking missiles for all the other sizes for higher accuracy, since the larger missiles have similar damage across the different tracking types. Also, since we're talking missiles, I want to explain the missile rack system even though it hasn't changed in 3.17. A ship will come with hardpoints for missile racks of a specific size, just like it does for ship weapons. For example, an Avenger Titan has 2 size 3 missile hardpoints, so each hardpoint can fit a size 3 missile rack. The missile racks that you can fit to most ships follow a naming convention starting with the letters MSD-. The numbers after that prefix are the size of the missile rack, the number of missiles it can hold, and the size of missiles it can hold. So for example, the MSD-341 rack means it's a size 3 rack that can hold 4 size 1 missiles. For a given size of missile hardpoint, you can get different racks that hold different sizes of missiles. The largest missile it can hold is the same as the size of the hardpoint. So for example, a size 3 hardpoint on an Avenger Titan can hold 1 size 3 missile if you equip the 313 rack. You can increase the number of missiles on that hardpoint by swapping the rack to one that holds smaller missiles. So instead of 1 size 3 missile, you could get 2 size 2s or 4 size 1s. This relationship exists for missile racks of all sizes, as you can see here. On the right side, you can see the total damage of all the missiles in the rack, so you can carry the most damage by carrying lots of the smallest missiles possible, until you get to the size 5 missiles, where the damage takes a big step up and the missiles are called torpedoes. One thing to note is that a given missile rack needs to carry the same exact missile in all its slots, so a 481 rack needs 8 of the same size 1 missiles, but you can change missiles on different racks however you like. When changing missiles in the Vehicle Loadout Manager, you need to unequip all of the existing missiles first before the game lets you select a different type of missile for the rack. The last thing worth mentioning is that some ship hulls come with custom missile racks that can't be swapped and usually don't follow the naming convention. Origin is the worst offender, with many of their ships having custom racks, but there are a bunch of other ships as well, like the new Scorpius. The last major change to talk about is the most obvious one if you've done any bounty hunting in 3.17, and that is the fact that the NPCs are much more active and the AI is running much more smoothly than it ever has before. You can't just fly into the middle of 4 VHRT enemies and side strafe and hope they miss most of their shots, because they won't. This higher incoming DPS means that we want a ship with higher burst damage. Before, since you could avoid a lot of damage with simple maneuvering, this meant that you could stay in the thick of things pretty consistently, so you wanted to maximize your sustained DPS. Now that you are taking so much more damage, you can't stay in the fight for long, and you'll regularly have to disengage to recharge your shields. The problem is, if you're disengaging to recharge shields, the enemy is recharging theirs as well, so you ideally want to be able to kill at least one enemy when you engage. So to increase our burst damage, we're going to use more missiles, and we'll start incorporating some of the more ammo-friendly ballistics, primarily the newly available AD-5B and AD-4B Gatlings. In 3.16, I was strongly against ballistics because you could easily chain bounties back to back using a fully energy-based loadout until you needed to refuel. But in 3.17, it's much more difficult to chain lots of missions since you have so many factors working against you, like bad desync, inconsistent hit detection, the less effective size 2 shields, the new semi-frequent hydration requirements, broken altitude readings, and a much more accurate and evasive AI, resulting in longer fights, which means you'll take more damage that needs to be repaired. So because of all of those factors, I think it's a good idea to use a limited source of burst damage to help you be more successful with these more difficult bounties. The way 3.17 is shaping up, I see 2 main options. You can go energy based to maximize for sustainable damage and be limited by how frequently you have to repair, or you can go for a hybrid energy ballistic setup to get higher burst damage to end fights faster so that you take less damage and repair and restock all at once. On ships that can fit the new size 4 and size 5 ballistic Gatlings, I'm going for the hybrid approach, because the size 4 AD-4B Gatling is a 70% DPS increase over the previously available size 4 ballistic cannons, And the size 5 85B Gatling has the same DPS as the previous size 5 cannons, while being able to fire twice as long. Also, ships that have more guns typically do more DPS than ships that have fewer higher caliber guns from size 1 to size 4, so that's usually what you want to go for if you're torn between two options. And for ships like the Reliance, Hornets, and Buccaneer, where you can choose between a single higher caliber weapon or a mount with two lower caliber weapons, you'll typically want the mount with two weapons for more DPS unless you want to fit something that only comes in the higher caliber. You can also kill enemies faster with gimbals. They still work decently in 3.17, but the auto gimbal setting resets to fixed every time you change to quantum mode or missile mode, and it won't even stay auto gimbaled if you change your settings to be auto gimbaled by default. Despite the inconvenience, gimbals are still worth using in many cases because targets seem to evade fire much more than previously, wiggling back and forth to minimize your time on target. Gimbals also make it easier to be much more evasive yourself, which is the best way to increase your staying power in a fight. I've found my survivability increases drastically with light and medium fighters if I corkscrew by thrusting up or down while rolling my ship. This makes my path trace the path of a corkscrew, which makes me harder to hit and lets me shake off a lot of the incoming damage. If I'm not using gimbals, I'll pause maneuvering while shooting and then get back to maneuvering while reloading. I also like to fly decoupled while doing this on moons or planets, but in space that can be risky if there are asteroids or debris littering the battlefield. After I'm done speeding towards my target, I like to keep my speed limiter at or slightly above the SCM speed while I'm in combat so that I can be as agile as possible while still giving me a bit of room to GTFO boogie if needed. And don't forget that your ship's bottom and rear thrusters are the strongest, so you'll want to roll and pitch over to take advantage of those to help you turn or change your speed rather than just turning left and right, which uses your much weaker side strafe thrusters. You can also use this to help you stop jousting with enemies by pitching your ship in advance to the direction the enemy is flying and scrubbing off most of your speed while your ship is pointing its lower and rear thrusters in the direction you are traveling. One of the best things you can do if you're not already doing it is actively managing your capacitor in a fight. Capacitor management is key to maximizing your DPS while you're attacking and regenning your shield and thrust quickly when you're disengaging. I have keybinds set to maximize my capacitor to weapons, shields, or thrusters in a single tap. I recommend the 1, 2, and 3 keys if you're using mouse and keyboard, or put it on your joystick if you have one. I keep my power to weapons by default, and I'll typically only swap them to shields when my shields get low or go down. Also, since you need to give your shields 5 seconds of not being hit before they start recharging, you'll typically only want to put powers to shield if you've been evading a lot of fire in combat or if you've boosted away from the fight to disengage. If you see on your shield MFD that you're not locked out of recharge, you can also steal a few seconds of shield recharge when you're burning through your ammo magazine to minimize combat downtime. Also, component damage is back, so you should disengage when your shields are low and try and avoid fighting while your shields are down. I've had a few instances of my shields getting damaged, and I've gotten a couple messages that I've never seen before about a shield generator irregularity and a shield generator drain. My shields charged really slowly when I got the irregularity message, so components will actually degrade in their effectiveness as they get really damaged. And I've also had it where one of my 2 shield generators gets completely destroyed and my shield MFD showed me that the shields only charge to half their max value. That said, some warnings are so commonplace that you can kind of ignore them, like the major torque imbalance. You'll get this message if your thrusters are missing even a single point of HP, and all that happens with light damage is that your ship pulls to the side a bit. If the damage gets worse, it'll actually severely impact your thrust capability, but usually by then it's obvious there's a problem. You may also want to disengage if there's 3 or 4 enemies that you're fighting at once and they're all close to you on radar, because the enemy AI is still very RAM happy. If you're boosting away and resetting the engagement, you can string them out as they close the gap back to you so you don't risk getting blown up by one of them ramming you. I'm looking at you, Cutlass Blacks. Now I'm going to go through some random tips and info about bounties in 3.17. The useful thing you can do is change some of your settings to make space combat easier. The first one is Pilot Look Ahead. When it's enabled, your camera will start looking in the direction that your ship is turning, but the problem is that when you're maneuvering in combat, that can make it harder to keep track of your target while you're flying around them. The next one is auto zoom on targeted enemies. This one is bad because while you're in combat, your view will zoom in a bit on the enemy that you've targeted, which will reduce your vision of the other enemies or obstacles around you, potentially causing you to crash. I also highly recommend turning the pilot velocity indicator to always on instead of fading. This means that it'll always show you two arrows indicating the direction that your ship is moving in, whereas by default it would disappear if you're traveling mostly forwards. The problem is, if it disappeared, you don't know if that means you're going forwards or if you're traveling off to the side, so I consider this a must-have for decoupled flight, especially at night. The last one is to disable G-Save. G-Save basically prevents your ship from using its full thrust if that would cause you to start blacking out. With bounties being much more difficult now, we need all the maneuvering that our ship can give us, so I'd recommend turning it off and just manually throttling back your maneuvers if you start to black out too much. Blacking out a little bit is fine though, that won't hurt you. All of these options are in the Game Settings tab of the Options menu, and here's what they're called. Distortion has been nerfed in 3.17, but it's not useless. I've still been able to disable medium and heavy fighters with distortion cannons, but I don't think the C788 ballistic cannon is too useful anymore though. You can actually suffocate and die if the enemy does enough damage to your ship to depressurize the cockpit, like what happened to me here in the Saber. So yeah, make sure you put on at least an undersuit and a helmet when going into combat. Quantum travel seems to have gotten less reliable since 3.16. I frequently have to swap targets and realign to get it to work. This is worth noting if your strategy is to kill the primary target in a bounty mission and then warp away. Quantum does seem to work more consistently when I'm warping to a target that's not near anything else at all though. Hurricanes seem to have much less tanky hull than they did in 3.16, but they can still take a long time to kill because they move around a lot and they are a small target. They've been replaced by Valkyries though, which seem like they take the longest to kill now in VHRTs, but that feels more appropriate given their beefy size. Altitude markers on many moons don't work, so it's much harder to determine how close you are to the ground during bounties on the dark side. Keep using the scan ping to help you illuminate the ground so that you can keep getting your bearings. Enemy missiles can usually be sent away from you by firing off a decoy or two as soon as you hear the incoming missile notification. If the incoming missile indicator went away, the decoys were successful, but if not, you can try firing another decoy or two. You can press the right Alt key plus H to increase the number of decoys you fire, or the left Alt key plus H to decrease them. Larger ships often need 2 or more since their tracking signatures are larger. You should fire your own missiles while about 5k away from the enemy. It's close enough to minimize their time to respond with decoys, but not so close that the missile will have time to immediately change from their travel mode to their final target seeking mode, which will sometimes have them flying off in random directions, even without the enemy using decoys. And EM missiles are still a great missile type to use since most ships have high EM signatures. I've also seen Hurricanes get disabled and fall to the ground when hit by multiple size 1 EM missiles. If you're going with the max damage Arrow 1 missiles, then I'd fire those from about 6 to 7k out. In Microtech space, the VHRT bounties aren't showing up in the list, and HRTs are showing up twice. One of those HRTs is actually a VHRT, and you can tell which one based on the payout, since the VHRT will have the higher 17.5k payout. It'll also spawn with VHRT level enemies though, so it's just a naming bug in the contract, you're not getting some extra free money. When thinking about a ship's maneuverability, it's easy to just compare the maximum rotational turn rates of the pitch, roll, yaw that show up in Urkel, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. A ship won't instantly be able to turn at those rates, they'll have to accelerate up to turn at those rates. You see this most clearly in large ships where they take a while to start turning and then they can overshoot what they're trying to aim at because just like they can't instantly turn at their max rate, they can't instantly stop turning either. Another major part of a ship's agility comes from its translational thrust, which is basically how many G's can it pull in the up, down, left, right, forwards, backwards dimensions. This is often overlooked, but it plays a big part in how well a ship can maneuver in combat. So you can think of it as the rotational turn rates let you quickly change which way you're pointing, but the translational movement lets you change which way you're actually going, and you need both for space combat. I've actually been measuring how many Gs a ship can pull in each direction and putting it in a spreadsheet to make it easier to compare ships. I haven't covered every ship yet, but I've got a lot in there. That's also where I share what combat fits I like to use for different ships, so feel free to check it out. It's linked in the description if you're curious. The last thing is that you can use a lead or lag pip for your aim. These are two different ways to see how to aim your ship so that you can hit a moving target while you're also moving. The lead pip is enabled in the game by default, and it shows a targeting reticule where you should aim the center of your crosshairs to land your shots on your target. I prefer to use the lag pip though, which actually shows where on your target your shots will land. I prefer this because it helps you to focus your attention on your target so you can better predict their movement, and also so that you can see when your shots might still hit the edges of a target versus a lead pip where the reticule will only turn green when the shots are aimed at the center mass. You can find the setting to change between the two under the Game Settings tab of the Options menu. Well, that's all for my update on the 3.17 bounties. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments about my recommendations or tips. Thanks for watching, folks. I hope you've liked this video. Cheers.